Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be doing a full build and review of the High Plains 1/72 scale Australian built Beaufort Mk.VIII. So I've previously done an in-box review of this kit as well as the Mk.IX freighter version of the Beaufort. So if you haven't seen that video, go check it out as it'll give you a bit of an idea on what's in the box and the quality you can expect from these kits. But without further ado, let's have a go at building this limited edition Australian made model kit. To begin with, I gave all the parts, including the metal and vacuform ones, a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue from them which may prevent paint or glue from adhering to them. Once the sprues were dry, I then cut out the fuselage halves using some Tamiya side cutters, and then I used a knife to scrape away the massive amounts of flashing and excess plastic from the fuselage halves. I also cut out and cleaned up the interior floor parts, the cockpit pedestal, the main instrument panel with its moulded rudders, and the bulkhead for the bombardier's position. Smaller parts for the interior included the control column, which was done in soft white metal, and the pilot seat, navigator's chair and framework, which were done in plastic and required a little bit more cleanup. Once cleaned up, I then glued the main instrument panel to the left fuselage front bulkhead, and then assembled the pilot's floor section, center pedestal, and the framework for attaching the navigator's seat. I added the additional piece for the bombardier's panel on the right fuselage, and once the framework was solid on the left side, I then glued the navigator's seat into its place. After the time-consuming cleanup of the cockpit parts had been completed, they all seemed to fit rather well with relatively decent detail. I gave the cockpit parts a chance to fully dry and in the meantime cut out the wing halves and started to clean those up with a knife. After they'd been cleaned up of excess flash, I started on the main landing gear assembly, which was mostly made out of white metal and required a tiny bit of cleanup. I used Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue to glue the metal parts and the plastic together, and it seemed to do a pretty good job. The main struts were glued first to the lower wing halves, followed by the rear supporting arms. These metal parts were rather delicate and easy to bend out of shape, but they seemed to fit to each other relatively well and to the wing, and could be bent back to shape if required. For some extra cockpit details, I cut out some thin wire and used it to make the engine controls on the center pedestal, as well as to add some extra details. To strengthen the landing gear attachments, I added a little bit of putty over the main and second strut joints to further cement them to the wing and to each other. The engine was cut out and required a large amount of cleanup from flash, although the details seemed decent enough. The engine cowlings were also cut out at this time and had their flash and imperfections carved out as best as I could, although I would have a little bit of troubles with their fit later on. I used a Dremel to drill out the center hole for the propellers to attach to, although I probably didn't need to bother as it turns out the propellers didn't really have a shaft properly moulded. They had a massive amount of flash and imperfection as well on their blades, which required a lot of carving with the knife and also a fair bit of sanding to clean off. Some parts of the wing had a grainy sort of texture to them, so I used some fine sandpaper to remove that, and where I could, I then restored the panel lines using my Tamiya scribing tool. I did consider scribing all of the panel lines on the kit a second time to make them a bit stronger, but at the time of making this model I didn't have much experience with it, so I didn't feel comfortable trying to redo the whole model and instead just did a few of the panels when they got sanded over. After cleaning up a few spots on the wing and rescoring them, I then used some Vallejo water-based putty to patch up any mistakes I'd made when scribing. I glued the engine cowls together and found they fitted okay, but there were still some nasty imperfections and a fair bit of a gap. The main engine nacelle halves were then cut out of the sprue and also cleaned up. Unusually, they had the landing gear doors moulded to them in the extended position, so if you were building this kit and wanted the landing gear to be in the retracted position, you'd have to do a bit of surgery. It seemed the upper wing halves were better moulded than the other parts in this kit, so once they were cut out, rather than having to do a lot of cleanup, I instead simply glued them to their lower wing halves and used some Tamiya masking tape to hold them together while the glue dried. After drilling out a hole in the now quite solid cockpit floor for the control column to slot into, I then began to paint the interior with several coats of watered down Tamiya XF71 cockpit green. Thinning the paint with water helps it to flow more into the gaps, and it also helps keep the layers nice and thin, which means that although you have to apply more coats, you are less likely to end up with visible brush strokes or lose any surface detail under any thick parts of paint. Although water seems to do a good job of both cleaning the paints and also thinning them down, it does cause them over time to go a little bit dry and funny, so at some point in the future I will try and switch to using just the X20A acrylic thinner. The XF71 was also applied to the landing gear bay, inside of the engine cowlings, and on the inside of the engine nacelles and landing gear doors. 2 more coats of XF71 were then applied to these places, making a total of 3 coats, which is a pretty good minimum to aim for when painting by hand. The control column was also painted a coat of XF71 and would receive some further details before it was installed. After the 3rd coat had dried, I then started to pick out the finer details, first using Vallejo model colours flat black to paint the instrument panel along with the pedestal, various raised parts of the cockpit, and some of the control column based on reference photos. Next, a bit of Vallejo model colour flat white was dry brushed onto various raised details and dabbed on the inside of the main panel's recessed gauges to add details since no decals were included for the panel. Once the white had dried, I then dry brushed black over the instrument panel to neaten up any mistakes. Vallejo model colour vermilion red was used for various engine controls and some of the raised details, along with some Vallejo Luftwaffe camouflage green. Finally, I neatened up any mistakes I'd made with some XF71, before then getting out some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium to create some metal chipping on the rather nicely moulded cockpit ribbing, as well as the floor, bulkheads, navigator's table, and the seats. There was a section of the wing root which would be visible in the cockpit, so I also painted this XF71 and later chipped it with the XF16 as well. The seat cushions for the navigator and pilot were painted Tamiya XF52 flat earth, along with the buttons on the control column. The final touch for the cockpit was to add a coat of Tamiya's enamel-based black panel liner scent to highlight all the details, and also add a grimy and dirty effect. Once this had been applied and dried, I then used a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinner to remove the excess panel liner and help lighten up the raised detail areas. The enamel thinner also helps it to flow more into the gaps and recesses, helping to highlight the details using capillary motion. Finally, the control column was glued to the cockpit floor with the rocket glue, and I then joined the fuselage halves. They didn't fit together perfectly, probably due to the fact that there are no guide pins to help line them up, and the moulding quality on them was pretty poor. Some tape was used to hold the parts together while they bonded, and after the fuselage had had a few hours to dry, I then removed the tape and glued the wings to the fuselage. They seem to lock together pretty well thanks to the large amount of wing root detailing for the interior, but they were a tiny bit wonky and didn't quite sit at a proper angle to the fuselage. The 2 engine nacelles were then test fitted into place, and after they'd been cleaned up of any imperfections to make sure they fitted pretty flush, I then glued along the joint between them and the wings. I cut out the horizontal stabilizer halves and gave them the normal cleanup treatment in this kit, before then gluing the halves together. The main wheels came in 2 halves as well, which had some nice details on the edges and the front, but they had a lot of flash and there were quite a fair few imperfections, which required some touch-ups, which sadly took away a bit of this detail. The transparent nose and cockpit windows come as part of a vacuformed piece, which has to be cut out of its sheet and then carefully cleaned up using some scissors. There was also a window for the bomb aimer's position, a landing light cover which unfortunately I would somehow lose, and a few different options for turrets. Speaking of which, the rear turret hole in the fuselage was given a light sanding, and I also sanded the cockpit area including one of the bulkheads with a file. I then cut out the turret I needed and used some polystyrene sheets to scratch build a floor and bulkhead for the turret to sit on and glued these to the fuselage. The horizontal stabilizers received some more sanding along with the flash-filled slot for them to fit into on the fuselage, and once they had been cleaned up, I then glued them to the fuselage. They fitted alright, but required a fair bit of pressure to hold them to the fuselage as the glue bonded to make sure they were at the correct angle. With the majority of the assembly completed, I began to fill the massive amount of gaps in this kit using some Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty. This putty was applied over the rear turret bulkheads, along the joint between the fuselage halves, where the wings join to the fuselage, and also around the engine nacelles and to fill the gap between the cowlings. Once applied, a damp paper towel was used to wipe away any excess, and then the putty was left to dry. Once the putty had dried, I used a Dremel to drill out a hole for the rear turret to slot into the new bulkhead, and once that had been neatened up with a knife and file, I used some sandpaper to remove the excess putty from all of the joints. I used my scriber to rescore the panel lines where the putty had filled them in or the sanding had weakened them further, and after the scribing was completed and the engine cowlings had been cleaned up, I then attached the main wheels to the landing gear and had to glue one of the struts back to the wing using some super glue. The engine detail was glued to the inside of each engine cowling, which surprisingly it fitted alright with, and then the cowlings were glued to the engine nacelles. Once these were in place, I gave the model a wash in some water to remove any of the dust from the large amount of sanding which had occurred, and then I could begin the painting process with the transparent parts. I first applied some XF71 interior green to the framework and areas I would be applying exterior paint to on the clear parts, to create a layer of paint which would act as the interior colour that would be visible through all the windows, but hidden under the later layers of paint. I wanted to do my Beaufort as an aircraft that had been present at the Battle of Milne Bay during the early part of September 1942, and although these aircraft would have technically been an earlier mark than the Mk.VIII from this kit, they still had the same larger tail and Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engines seen extensively in Australian aircraft. The main difference would be the ASV antennas, which were not very well presented in this kit anyways. This aircraft would have most likely been painted in the usual RAF colours, or an American supplied equivalent more likely, with some grey undersides. For this scheme, I started painting the grey on the underside using some Tamiya XF81 RAF Medium Sea Grey 2. I mixed the paint with a bit of water to help thin it down, and then as much as possible applied it over the model in the same direction air would flow over the aircraft. The second colour I applied was XF52 Flat Earth, which was done in the same manner on the upper surface. I started with the Flat Earth there because it would be the lighter colour of the two colours in the camouflage. The canopies and turret had any excess XF71 scratched off to neaten up the framework, and while the first coat of paint dried on the upper surface, I applied a second coat of the medium sea grey on the underside. It's always a good idea to apply several layers of paint, as I mentioned when hand painting, to help reduce the brush strokes and prevent thick applications of paint from hiding the surface detail. Painting in the same direction will also help prevent the brush strokes. After a second coat of XF52 on the upper surface, I then painted the camouflage pattern with the darker XF81 Dark Green 2 RAF. To paint the camouflage patterns, I first created the outline of each shape and then carefully filled them in. I based the camouflage pattern on various pictures I found of the Beauforts, including the one that's currently in the Australian War Memorial. Once it had dried, I applied a second coat of the XF81 before then painting the exterior colours onto the raised canopy frame sections. A third coat of XF52 was then applied to help neaten up any mistakes I'd made with the green and to finalise the brown colour. A fourth coat of medium sea grey was applied, and after a few more coats of the two colours on the canopy, I then cleaned them up again with a sharp cocktail stick. One of the advantages of painting with the acrylics is that they can easily be scratched off the transparent parts if you make any mistakes, although obviously this does come at a slight cost of the durability of the paint. Once the camouflage painting was completed, I then applied a coat of Vallejo's water-based gloss varnish over the entire model. This water-based varnish can be applied with a brush to give a smooth and reasonably even gloss coat, which helps not only to protect the paint, but also gives a surface for the decals to be applied to, which prevents them from silvering. I left the aircraft overnight for the varnish to cure, and the next day began to cut out the decals, and then apply them after they'd been soaked in some warm water to make them come loose from the transfer paper. The pictures I found of Beauforts during the Battle of Milne Bay seemed to show a lack of any squadron codes on the aircraft, so in the end I just used a serial which was A9-184, which I found on ADF serials. This aircraft was from the correct squadron and appeared to be at Milne Bay during the battle, or at least towards the end, so it seemed like an appropriate choice. Once all the decals were in place, they then received a gentle dab from a cotton bud soaked in some Vallejo decal softener, which would help them soften to show the surface details of the model. I then applied a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them, which would further help them adhere to the model and its details. The Beauforts at Milne Bay also seemed to retain their red dots on their fuselage roundels, so I applied this by hand using some vermilion red once the decals had dried. I found that the canopy didn't seem to fit very well to the fuselage, so I ended up cutting around the fuselage sides and also gluing the nose section in separately. I would also leave the main canopy unglued so that I could remove it to put a pilot figure in at a later date. While the nose section fully bonded, I then applied a coat of Vallejo water-based matte varnish in the same manner I'd done with the gloss varnish. This time though, the matte varnish would help to protect the decals and also give the aircraft a matte uniform finish to help blend the decals and paint together and give a more accurate finish. I let the matte varnish dry overnight and then got out some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium and began to paint the engines and landing gear as well as create some metal chipping. For the metal chipping, I used a fine brush to dry brush it onto the leading edges of the wing, on the horizontal stabilizers, as well as along the walkway, the various access hatches around the aircraft, and on the engine cowling. A second coat of XF16 was also applied to the wheels, and several coats were painted onto the spinners and the white metal machine guns. Vallejo flat black was painted onto the blades of the props, as well as on the tyres and some of the machine gun details in several coats. XF24 dark grey was used for the centre gearbox part of the engine, and after the metal chipping had dried, I then applied some touch-ups with the 3 camouflage colours to not only reduce the metal chipping and make it a little bit more reasonable in certain areas, but also to create a more faded and layered look. The tip of each blade was carefully painted several coats of Vallejo flat yellow, and then I glued the bomb aimer's window into place. Towards the end of this build, I received some Vallejo Model Air colours which I'd be using for future RAF colours. I decided to test out Vallejo Model Air IDF Green as an alternative to XF71, and this was applied to the rear turret as well as the landing gear doors and the interior of the rear turret. Model Air gunmetal was used to paint the barrels of the machine guns, and Vallejo Model Colour Oily Steel was painted onto the exhausts. The vacuform parts around the bombardier's position seemed to have a fair few gaps, so I ended up using some putty to fill them in, and later I painted over them with the appropriate camouflage colours. After a final coat of black on the wheels and the propellers, I got out some Tamiya black Panaline Ascent once more and applied it along the panel lines on the upper and lower surfaces of the model to help highlight them and also create a weathered and post-shading effect. The panel liner was also applied heavily to the engines, the propeller and to the landing gear to help highlight their details. I assembled the rear turret and installed its guns while the panel liner dried, and then I got out some Tamiya X21 enamel thinners and used a cotton bud to again rub it off the model in certain areas to help the panel line flow into recesses and also to soften the effect. Further weathering was done using some of Tamiya's water-based master powder pigments. The black pigment was built up coming from the rear of both exhausts to create the exhaust streaking and a build-up of soot effect. The rust pigment was also used around the exhausts by lightly applying it onto the exhaust itself to add a few rust marks and give it a more worn out appearance. The mud and sand colour pigments were applied quite heavily to the walkway area, as well as on the wheels and around the tail and main landing gear to create some splashed up mud effects, as though the aircraft had been operating out of unpaved or muddy airstrips, such as Milne Bay itself. The Tamiya master powders can be applied dry onto the model to highlight raised details, or they can be mixed with a little bit of water to make a much thicker effect that also flows into any of the recesses. Once they're applied onto the model, they can be blended together using a little bit of water, or even removed to help create a softer effect. For the exhaust streaks, I also created some extra swirls and helped to spread them in the direction of the airflow by using a damp brush. Once the weathering powders had dried, I then used some micro crystal clear to create the small fuselage windows. I had to 3D print a replacement pitot tube and main radio mast, as the originals seemed to be missing from the kit, and after those had been glued onto the model and painted, I then attached the propellers using some blue tack so I could still spin them for animations. The landing lights were created using 2 bits of spare circular sprue which were glued to the wing, and then I cut out and shaped a spare piece of vacuform to create the cover. The lights were then painted Vallejo Model Air RLM01 aluminium, and I used my Dremel at this stage to drill out the intakes on both of the wings, which I believe was for the oil cooler. Admittedly, I probably should have done this a little bit sooner, but once I'd done drilling, I then dusted off the model using a brush and painted the inside of the intakes with some flat black. Finally, I got out some AK Interactive's mega thin rigging wire and glued one end to the tail and then wrapped the opposite end to the mast and glued it into place. This was a lot easier said than done and was a rather fiddly and annoying process, but once this was completed and the canopy had been added, the High Plains 1/72nd scale DAP Beaufort was finally completed. And here you can see the final result I was able to achieve with this kit. And it's safe to say the build process for this one was a rather challenging and not particularly pleasant one. The terrible moulding quality of this kit and lack of guide pins made aligning the parts tricky, and I spent a fair amount of time cutting and sanding away imperfections just trying to get them to fit together. In the end, I feel like I got a decent enough result, especially considering how bad this kit was, although it definitely isn't going to be winning any prizes, not that that's why I do this hobby in the first place. I'm pretty confident though that this kit will be decent enough to use in my planned Milne Bay film, although I will also look at a better, more detailed Beaufort kit for any close-up shots where this kit's cruder nature may be a little bit too obvious. I was surprised that the interior was at least half decent out of the box, and I have to say I'm pretty happy with how my camouflage and weathering turned out. As I mentioned, I'm going to try experimenting more with both the Vallejo Model Air colours for future RAF or RAF colours, as well as trying out Tamiya's acrylic thinner to see if I can improve my results in these builds further and prevent the issue of drying out Tamiya paints. So my final conclusion would be that unless you want to have the experience of making a High Plains kit of this era, I would suggest exploring other options if you want a decent Australian Beaufort in 1/72nd scale. If I was going to do another, I would probably get the Airfix kit instead and buy, or more likely for me, design and then 3D print a conversion set to get the correct tail and engines. I will still have a go at the High Plains Beaufreighter version in the future, since it would be a lot harder to convert a Beaufort kit to this version, although it's going to take me quite a few easier builds and a fair bit of time before I feel like having a go at another High Plains kit. So that's pretty much it for this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel. And if you have any suggestions on how I can improve, especially considering I'm looking at doing the Beaufreighter eventually, then let me know in the comment section below, or if you have any questions as well. Big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits and, of course, the products that I use to make them. This week's been a little bit interrupted and is a bit interesting as we've been given a cyclone warning for the area where I'm in, which is rather unusual. They don't usually come this far south. So I'm hoping everything's gone according to plan and I've gotten this video out on time. I was hoping to do 2 videos this week, but in the time it takes to prepare for the cyclone with clearing out the gutters and all of that and making sure everything's tied down, I haven't really had the time to do a second video, plus I'm not trusting the internet is going to remain up in time for me to do it. So it's just one video for this week, but hopefully things will be back to normal next week. But otherwise, thanks again for making it this far, and of course, as always, take care, and until the next video, model on.